Joining me now, NBC's Shannon Pettypiece. Also here with us, Hofstra University Professor of Law, James Sample. Shannon, these arguments just wrapped up, I understand. Give me the headlines.
Well, so at the center of this is whether or not the president has the constitutional authority to be able to impose these tariffs, because the Constitution gives pretty clear powers of tariffs to Congress. But the president is trying to use this exception, this Emergency Powers Act, to say that there is an emergency, a national emergency, when it comes to trade that should allow him to be able to put these tariffs in place. And have a listen to a little bit of what the lawyers for both sides had to say here today.
In its wisdom, Congress understood that in an emergency, the president may not have the time to go through all of the procedures and have a rulemaking process and have an investigation to address an extraordinary threat to the United States.
You just heard an argument in responses to Judges Hughes, Stark, and Dyke that our federal courts are powerless, that the president can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, for as long as he wants, so long as he declares an emergency. That is as major a question as it gets, a breathtaking claim to power that no president has asserted in 200 years, and the consequences are staggering.
So now we have to wait for the appeals court to make this ruling. It will probably then go to the Supreme Court. But at stake here are all of these so-called reciprocal tariffs that the president has announced, the 25% on India, the 90% on Brazil, these tariffs on China. So it could be billions of dollars for companies at stake here.
Yeah, and that word emergency, I guess, James, depends on what the meaning of the word emergency is. But Donald Trump has invoked it in a number of different cases. That is really at the heart of this?
Absolutely. I mean, there's some easy cases, right? Pearl Harbor is an emergency. COVID was an emergency. The question, the legal question in some respects is, given that IEEPA, the statute at issue here, Congress is the only body that has the power to impose tariffs. It can delegate that power to the president. The question is really whether or not Congress has delegated that power to the president here. And really the debate comes down to whether or not a 50-year pattern that the government's own briefs say is a persistent and consistent state that of trade deficits is an emergency, or whether it is unusual and specific, which would be the kind of emergency of Pearl Harbor or of COVID, right? So if the 50-year trade deficit is an emergency, then the bounding of the term emergency power is pretty much boundless.
Which is pretty much what Neil Katyal was arguing, right? So what happens if the appeals court finds out that Trump has been acting unlawfully?
Well, that is what the lower court already found here, but then that ruling was stayed pending this appeal. I think it's reasonably likely that this court, it's an en banc panel, 11 of the 12 judges on the court heard the argument today. If the court finds, as the lower court did, I suspect we will again get another stay, which means that this process is delayed until the Supreme Court ultimately determines whether or not these tariffs are in fact legal.
And then if it does head to the Supreme Court, this is the point that Neil Katyal made earlier today on Morning Joe.
That's what the president is saying. It's an emergency. I can do whatever I want. And that is something the Supreme Court has rejected time and time again. They rejected it with President Truman and the steel mills. They rejected it with President Bush and Guantanamo. They rejected it with President Bush also with respect to the Medellin case. So this is like something that, the Supreme Court's ruled on many times. But just through the lens of history, the arguments that President Trump are making today are not ones that have convinced courts in the past.
So if it goes to the Supreme Court, James, maybe I should ask, who will you be watching?
Well, as with every Supreme Court argument these days, we'll be watching Chief Justice Roberts. We'll be watching Amy Coney Barrett. I think Neil Katyal is in a strong position here. The question is whether or not the Trump administration can essentially outdeal the legal timeline, right? So the Trump administration can engage in negotiations that result in deals where he's not imposing tariffs. That's a different scenario. And so legally, I think that the challengers of these tariffs are on firm ground, but politically, the administration may nonetheless get what it wants.
James Sample, Shannon Pettypiece, thank you both so much.